has lost her pearl string bracelet. If you come across it, it belongs to her right here. Okay, thank you. And now on to other business. I am Nancy Blonsky, and on behalf of Pastor Kenny, Pastor Blonsky, and the staff and the Women's Guild, I welcome you to St. Matthew Lutheran Church and School. We are thrilled that you're here this afternoon with us for our annual event. Would you please bow your head in prayer? Heavenly Father, we thank you for everyone that is gathered here today. We thank you that you know each of us by name and have caused us to walk with you. Inspire our hearts today. Come fill our lives with your love. Fill our conversations with grace and truth. Fill this gathering with your presence, and we ask this for your glory and praise. Amen. Amen. Jackie Kennedy, journalist, writer, spoke 3 different languages, Spanish, French, and Italian, book editor, First Lady who transformed the White House, and even won an Emmy for her televised tour of the White House. Today, we will learn about the elegant, poised, and intensely private former First Lady, Jacqueline Kennedy. We will explore her varying roles as a wife, a mother, a hostess, and learn of her participation in the political campaigns and the cultural initiatives. Ladies, I introduce to you Jackie Kennedy.
I also would like to thank everyone for coming today, and I am so glad that I have not had to keep anyone waiting. It's so hard for me just to get around these days. The crowds outside my house in Washington, they are just impossible. Tourists everywhere. Do you know that they eat lunch on my lawn and they throw their sandwich wrappers on the ground? And it's like this every day. We have busloads of tourists going by. I can always hear the guides on the loudspeakers saying, "This is the home of Jacqueline Kennedy, Caroline, and John. We have become a sort of, well, there ought to be a nicer word for it than freak show, but I don't know what it is. I really am becoming rather sick and tired of starring in everyone's vacation movies. Thus, you see, my dark glasses. It might be that all of them are looking at me, but none of them can ever tell who I am looking back at. That way at least I can have some fun with it. To be quite honest with all of you, I hardly know what I'm going to do next. Should I stay in Washington with no privacy and stared at constantly? I know that when my husband died, I always said I was going to stay in the places where Jack and I had lived, but now I'm not so sure. I hardly know what to do next. Oh, but forgive me. All of you did not come here today to hear about my troubles. My topic today is not the incessant nuisance of the prying public, but rather my experiences as the wife of a U.S. senator and then president. Of course, for that, I hardly know where to begin. My experiences, you know, were not at all like those of most first ladies. Very few of them have come in the White House with 2 small children. You know, I had to hire a press secretary, and I told her, my primary goal is to protect my privacy and my children's, but not to offend the press. I would like to have minimum information, be given out with maximum politeness. You tell reporters I will be a wife and mother first, then First Lady. Oh, I still hate that term, First Lady. It always sounds to me like some sort of saddle horse. Do you know, Caroline was affected very young. She spoke her very first words during the 1960 presidential primary. Would you like to know what they were? Goodbye, New Hampshire, Wisconsin, and West Virginia. I said to Jack, well, I'm sorry that so few states have primaries. We would have had a daughter with the greatest vocabulary of any 2-year-old in the country. When we got to the White House, I knew she would have to go to school. And if she were in the newspapers all the time, it would affect her little classmates. They might have treated her differently. So, we set up a nursery school and then a kindergarten right in the White House. The children's parents paid all the expenses for the teachers and the supplies. I just wanted to provide as much of a sense of normalcy as I could. Normalcy, as if that were even possible in the White House. I always tried to work in the morning and then save lunch and as much of the afternoon as I could for the children. If you bungle raising your children, I don't think it matters very much what else you do. If Jack had been the greatest president of the century, but his children turned out badly, it would have been tragic. But of course, when you are married to a politician, you really can't not be involved in their politics. Even when Jack and I were dating, this was back in 1952, Jack was heavily involved in his Senate campaign against Henry Cabot Lodge, so he was spending most of his weekends up in Massachusetts. He would call me up from some oyster bar with this great clinking of coins. I would find myself saying, Jack, darling, I can barely hear you. The movies on Wednesday? Yes, I will be here in Washington, but will you? How he could switch so rapidly from political campaigning to dating, I would never understand. This was always one of Jack's great charms, that ability to focus and then just shift focus so rapidly. My life did change when I met Jack, but not for the reasons most people think. We met at a dinner party in 1951, given by friends of ours who had been shamelessly matchmaking for nearly a year. Usually that sort of thing does not work out, but this time it did, so I am grateful. Jack was different, something special. I remember that my mother used to bring around all these bows for me, but Jack really was different. I was working at the time as a reporter for the Washington Times-Herald newspaper. I was their inquiring photography girl. Not very demanding work, but it got me out. My job was to walk the streets of Washington and ask hard-hitting questions like, do you think the rich enjoy life more than the poor do? Or, do you think that a wife should let her husband think he is smarter than she is? I even interviewed Jack. To him I said, tell me, Congressman Kennedy, can you think of any reason why a contented young bachelor would want to get married? The job was mostly to defy my mother. She had refused me a chance to do an internship at Vogue magazine. 6 months in New York, 6 months in Paris, and I won the contest for that internship, but my mother had other plans for me. My mother was always rather strict with us. She never hesitated to give us the back of her hand when she thought it necessary. We, that's my sister, Lee and I. Lee was always the pretty one. Guess I was supposed to be the smart one. If you see pictures of my family from when I was growing up, the gentleman that you probably will see will not be my father. You'll see my stepfather, Hugh Auchincloss. We called him Uncle Hughie. My mother married him when I was 11, 2 years after my parents divorced. I did see a good deal of my father, though, especially after I went away to boarding school at Miss Porter's. All my Farmington friends loved Daddy. He was the most devastating figure, drippingly handsome. All my friends adored him, and they used to line up to be taken out to eat whenever he came to visit. He would take batches of us out to lunch at the Elm Tree Inn and sit there, drink in hand, while we all ordered steaks and 2 desserts each. We must have eaten him broke. To my mother, school was supposed to lead to marriage. Parties and dances, I attended my fair share, but Newport, where I spent most of my summers when I was growing up, when I was about 19, I did not know what I wanted in life, but I knew I did not want to marry any of the young men I had grown up with. Not because of them, but because of their lifestyle. Handsome young scions of rich families. They bored me in about 5 minutes. I remember one time saying to a young man that I had just met, "I'm amazed. You have your whole life planned out? Let me see if I have this right. Career, marriage, house, dog, country club, children? Well, tell me, do you have your gravesite picked out yet?" Me? No. Only thing that matters to me in a man is that he weigh more and have bigger feet than I do. Size 10, good heavens. To my mother, this was the height of carelessness. "Jacqueline," she would say, "your choice of a husband is the most important decision you will ever make. Be smart, Jacqueline. Better to be bored with a rich man than bored with a poor one." So you see, when Jack and I were dating, I was not at all sure I even wanted to marry. A cousin of mine asked once, was there any truth to the rumors that Jack and I were serious? And I said to him, "You know, Jack goes to a hairdresser almost every day to have his hair done. And if, when we're at a party or a reception or something, if no one recognizes him and no photographers take his picture, he will sulk about it afterwards for hours." Really? He's so vain, you can't believe it. And he's ambitious, all right. He told me that he plans, well, his father plans, he will be President of the United States one day. My family had mixed feelings about Jack and his family. The Kennedys are like carbonated water, and all other families are just flat. We'd be talking about so many things with so much enthusiasm, or playing games at dinner or in the living room, anywhere. Everyone would be talking about something. They competed with each other in conversation to see who could say the most and talk the loudest. Watching them wore me out. The one person in my family who adored Jack was my father. My father and Jack hit it off right away. We three had supper shortly before we were engaged. Those two spent the whole night talking about, what else? Politics, sports, and girls. It's what all red-blooded men like to talk about, right? And are we all right? You can never tell when you have a very soft voice. It's hard, isn't it? I called up my Aunt Edie and I said, Aunt Edie, I want you to know I've become engaged to Jack Kennedy. Yes, but you cannot tell anyone about it for a little while. Because it wouldn't be fair to the Saturday Evening Post. The Post. They're coming out tomorrow with a story about Jack. On the cover, Jack Kennedy, the Senate's gay young bachelor. I know. I have taken the choicest bachelor in the Senate. Yeah, I was hoping for a small, elegant wedding, but the Kennedys would have none of that. We had 26 groomsmen and bridesmaids at our wedding. 900 guests at the mass, 1,200 at the reception. My mother was terrified of Jack because she couldn't push him around at all. I, of course, expected that my father would walk me down the aisle, but on the morning of the wedding, he started drinking. My mother refused to permit him even to attend. Uncle Hughie had to step in and walk me down the aisle. I would like to thank all of you so much for being here and sharing the day with us. You know, my mother always told me I should wait and judge a man by the quality of his correspondence. Wish you were here. Cheers, Jack. This is my entire correspondence from Jack Kennedy. Living with Jack was like being married to a whirlwind. He was indestructible. People who tried to keep up with him dropped like flies, including me. I remember one morning, the very first year we were married, he said to me, what are you having for the 40 people who are coming for luncheon today? No one had told me anything about it. It was 11 o'clock in the morning and they were expected at 1. I was in a panic. And Jack was traveling all over the country in those days, giving speeches. He was never home more than 3 nights in a row. I was alone almost every weekend. It was all wrong. Politics was sort of my enemy as far as our home life was concerned. And my other enemy? I went into my marriage with my eyes open. My sister-in-law, Joan, she was married to Jack's brother, Teddy. She had more illusions than I did. I remember saying to her once, Jonesy, I don't think that there are very many husbands who are faithful to their wives. Kennedy men are like that. They'll go after anything in a skirt. You have to block it out. Imagine you are turning the station on a radio when you don't like what's playing. But we worked it out. We made concessions. Jack learned to enjoy fine cuisine, more than just his favorite pigs in a blanket. I wound up a knack in history, and I learned how to golf. Jack began to dress much more fastidiously. He even agreed to go to art galleries and ballets with me. I did sometimes help him in his work. I could translate for him a speech on Indochina when so much of the original material was in French. But my most important role, the best thing that I could do for him, was to be a distraction. A husband lives and breathes his work all day long. If he comes home to more table thumping, how could the poor man ever relax? So I never said anything or did anything upsetting. And when he came home, I always liked to have his favorite record playing and perhaps a few friends. Oh, and his favorite drink, a daiquiri. I must share with you this. This is Jack Kennedy's favorite daiquiri recipe. You mix 2 parts rum with 2 parts frozen lime juice, add 1 part fresh lime juice, and a few drops of falernum. It's the fresh lime juice, that's key. I would have so much preferred to remain like that, behind the scenes, not out in front, always being stared at and analyzed, everything that you do, what you wear, what you say. I am so grateful to my parents for the efforts they made to teach us foreign languages. The people we met campaigning who contributed so much to our country, it always seemed to me only a proper courtesy to address them in their own tongues. Queridos amigos, les hablan la esposa del senador John F. Kennedy, candidato a la presidencia de los Estados Unidos. Para el futuro de nuestros niños, votan ustedes para el Partido Democrática. So much of politics is unfair. It always seemed to me so unfair of people to be against Jack merely because he was a Catholic. He was such a poor Catholic. If it had been his brother Bobby, I could have understood it more. And then all those letters saying I should change my hairstyle to one more fitting for the wife of a presidential candidate. Jack used to say to my secretary, "Oh, Mary, how's the mail coming on Jackie's hair?" Amusing, but also puzzling. What does my hairdo have to do with my husband's ability to be president? I did bar photographers from taking any photographs of me smoking. Jack was such a bear about my cigarettes. I finally started encouraging him to have a cigar after dinner, because at least that way he would not complain so much about my cigarettes. It's a bad habit that I picked up in boarding school. I was always trying to imitate the girls who had callers every Saturday night. I passed the finish line in the balcony of the Normandy Theater in New York by a girl who pressed a cigarette on me and then led me out of the theater when the usher came to say people could not hear the film with all that coughing going on. So I always said no photographs smoking. And then Women's Wear Daily reported that Jack's mother and I each spent $30,000 a year on French clothing. It's just dreadfully unfair. I could not spend that much unless I wore sable underwear. I'm sure that I spent less than Mrs. Nixon did on clothing. But I have to dress well, Jack, so I don't embarrass you as a public figure. You would be humiliated if your wife were photographed in some saggy old house dress. Everyone would say your wife is a slob and refuse to vote for you. Of course, for most of that campaign, I knew I was expecting another baby, and I could not play much part. I thought I should be with Jack, and if it hadn't been for the baby, I would have campaigned vigorously. I can't be so presumptuous as to think I would have had any impact on the outcome, but it would have been tragic if Jack had lost by a few votes merely because I was not at his side, and people had met Mrs. Nixon and liked her. Of course, at least it got me out of those dreadful chicken dinners. You know, where you're sitting at a head table and you couldn't have a cigarette, having to wear those silly corsages and listen to some old windbag. Throw me up the wall, poor Jack. But all his hard work paid off in November. His deepest wish, but his father's deepest wish come true. The 35th President of the United States. I heard Jack's inaugural address in bits and pieces many times when he was working on it at the Kennedy Winter Home in Palm Beach. But when I heard it that day in Washington as a whole for the first time, it was so pure and beautiful and soaring. I knew I was hearing something great. I knew it would go down in history as one of the greatest speeches ever given. Do you remember? Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. There was so much that I wanted to say to him, but I could hardly have embraced him in front of all those people. So I just said to him, Jack, you were wonderful. And he was smiling in the most touching and the most vulnerable way. His family was walking on air. But to me, it was terrifying. It really is frightening to lose all your anonymity at age 31. We had to begin giving parties and receptions, and we traveled a great deal, Jack and I. Fortunately, Jack never required much more from me than perhaps to give a short speech or two. I know we share the desire of bringing to all the people of this hemisphere a better life for themselves and their children. And I know you will agree with me, the good things in life, education, housing, employment, should be within the reach of all people and not just a few blessed by fortune. I never envied Jack the difficult tasks. In Vienna, such a difficult summit. Jack always compared the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, to his father. Always expecting all give, no take. There was little I could do except perhaps I could help the Khrushchevs feel more comfortable. One afternoon during a tea party, the crowds outside our room started calling out, Jackie, Jackie. So I asked Mrs. Khrushchev to come to the window with me, and we waved to the crowd together. Soon they were calling out, Jackie Nina, Jackie Nina. Small contribution to international diplomacy, perhaps, but it was something I could do. When I visited India and Pakistan, it was without Jack. I had no desire to be a public figure on my own, and the international press criticized me on that trip for wearing high fashion in a country so overrun with poverty. I finally had to tell my press attaché, do not release any more fashion information. I know that I am more of fashion interest than other first ladies, but really, I don't want to be plagued by any more fashion stories of a sensational nature. I don't want to be the Marie Antoinette or Empress Josephine of the 1960s. I'm glad I went, but I vowed never to do another trip like that again. Jack was so proud of me when I did something like that, but really, I can't stand being out in front. I know that this probably will sound trite, but what I really wanted was to be behind Jack, to be a good wife and mother. What I wanted most was to make the White House the most perfect house in America. That mansion is so much more than just the official center of the executive branch, a place to entertain. It should be a showplace of a great heritage and an inspiration to all Americans. But when Mrs. Eisenhower showed me around for the very first time, all I could think was, oh, God, that's the worst place in the world. It was so cold and dreary. It looked like it had been furnished by a discount furniture store during a January clearance. The windows did not open. When we tried to use the fireplaces, they smoked because they had not been used in so long. And so little about history. All these people were coming to see the White House. They saw almost nothing that dated to before 1948. I knew I would feel terribly if I lived in that house for 4 years and had done nothing for those rooms. Jack had to be convinced of the worthiness of that project. So, we set up a fine arts committee. We hired a curator. We went through all 54 rooms of the White House looking for forgotten historical treasures. I felt so strongly that the White House should have as fine a collection of American paintings as possible. Do you remember Walter Annenberg, the great newspaper and magazine publisher? He had a portrait of Benjamin Franklin that I knew would be perfect for the White House. So I called him up. I told him about our plans to make the White House a national monument. I said, Mr. Annenberg, you are the first citizen of Philadelphia. And of course, in his day, Ben Franklin was the first citizen of Philadelphia. Do you think one great Philadelphia resident would give the White House a portrait of another great Philadelphia resident? And do you know, even though that painting cost him more than $250,000, he gave it. We relied on donations like that, and the proceeds from a booklet that we put together all about the White House. Aside from the obvious benefit of having an official book, something that children could take home, I knew it would eventually be a source of revenue for us, so we would not have to beg and borrow for each item. So many things slipped through our hands because we could not raise the necessary money. I said to Jack, "You always balk at spending a few $1,000s for a lovely picture. You would spend any amount of money if it could buy you votes." But eventually he came around. It was Jack who decided we ought to have a television program about it. He convinced CBS to do the taping in the White House. Nervous? Absolutely. I think I only got through that taping with the help of Marlboros and several strong scotches. The program aired on Valentine's Day, February 14, 1962, simultaneously on CBS and NBC, and the following Sunday on ABC. I have been told 46 million Americans watched it. I was not one of them, but I am glad for the visibility that it gave to our work. I just thought everything in the White House should be the best. The entertainment that was given there, and if it was an American company you could help, I like to do that. If not, just so long as it was the best. My husband and I shared a belief that the artist should be honored by society. The arts have always been treated as a poor stepchild in this country. Our great museums and performing companies, of course, should be supported. And you know Jack tried so hard. When we succeeded in bringing Pablo Casals to the White House, you know, the great cellist, I had to station my social secretary, Letitia Baldridge, behind a doorway directly in Jack's line of view. That way she could signal to him when the music was really finished. Otherwise, there was always the danger that Jack would leap up at any slight pause in the music and start shaking the artist's hand. I had hoped so much to one day have a minister for the arts in the cabinet, as they do in France. Meeting the French Minister of Culture was one of the highlights of my years in the White House. "Monsieur Moreau," I said, "I have such an affinity for your country. Do you know both of my grandparents were French?" "What's that? Yours were too?" "Monsieur Moreau, I have been thinking so much about something you said. You said that art, that public places with sculpture can affect someone as they're rushing off to work, perhaps change their view of themselves. Oh, isn't that wonderful?" Family, though, that is most important. Whatever work I did, I never let it interfere with our family life. Jack and I both wanted a large family. When we found out last spring that I was expecting, we were both ecstatic. When Patrick was born, he only lived 2 days. And Jack was inconsolable. Shocking as it was for me, I think it was even worse for him. He nearly collapsed over it. I was so melancholy after Patrick's death. I went away on vacation, and perhaps I stayed away longer than I should have. Perhaps I was a bit snappish when I got back. I could have made his life so much happier those last few weeks. I could have tried harder to get over my melancholy. I could have kept him from going to Texas. It was a political fence-mending trip, starting the campaign for 1964. All that he said to me was, I'd I'd love you to go with me, but if you don't want to go, I will understand. You'd be a great help, but if you don't want to go, I understand. So I went with him to Texas, even though I knew I would hate every minute of it. Jack wanted me there. It seemed like a small sacrifice to make on my part. And certainly I did have a feeling it was going well. There were such big crowds of such wavy, nice, happy people. Wonderful assemblies with warm welcomes. 3 times we were greeted with the yellow roses of Texas. Only when we got to Dallas, they gave me red roses. I remember thinking, how funny to be given red roses instead of yellow roses when you're in Texas. When we got to Dallas, there was the biggest motorcade from the airport, and when we were all in the car and the motorcade was ready to begin, one of Jack's assistants came running up to me, and he said to me, "Now you make sure to look to your left, away from the president. You wave at the people on your side. You both wave at the same voter. It's just a waste." So in that motorcade, I usually was looking to the left, and Jack was looking to the right, which is one reason we were not looking at each other very often. And it was terribly hot, just blinding all of us. And I remember at one point, Mrs. Connolly, the governor's wife, who was sitting in front of me, she turned around and she said, "Well, Mr. President, you certainly can't say Dallas doesn't love you." And he said, "No, you can't," or something like that. And she said, "We'll be there soon." In a motorcade, there is always noise, and there are motorcycles beside you, a lot of them backfiring. There was a noise, but it didn't seem to me like any different sort of noise because there's so much noise, motorcycles and things. I was looking to the left, and I heard Governor Connolly suddenly yell out, "No, no, no!" So I turned to the right. All I remember is my husband. He had this sort of puzzled look on his face, and his hands were up. I remember thinking he looked just as if he had a slight headache. Just remember that, no blood or anything. And then he suddenly raised his hands, and he fell into my lap. And then I just remember being down in the car with his head on my lap. I know there were pictures later of me climbing out the back. I don't remember that at all. I just remember being down in the car, and there was so much confusion. And it seemed like an eternity, that ride to the hospital. And when we got to the hospital, they tried to take me away. They tried to grab me. But I kept saying to people, "I am not going to leave him. I am not going to leave him. I am not going to leave him." I remember this long corridor. This big policeman brought me a chair. So I watched them going in with saline solutions and other things, and for a minute I thought to myself, maybe he's not gone. Maybe he's still alive. I knew he was gone. Then I saw a doctor coming towards me, and he said to me, "Mrs. Kennedy, you need a sedative." And I said to him, "I want to be with him when he goes." And this doctor forced his way in. He just kept saying, "It's her prerogative, it's her prerogative." So I finally got in. There must have been 40 people in that tiny little operating room. There was already a sheet over Jack, but his foot was sticking out of the sheet. So I took his foot and I kissed that. And then someone found his hand under the sheet, and I just held onto it all the time that the priest was saying the extreme unction. All I could think was, if only I had been looking to the right. I would have seen the first shot hit him. I could have pulled him down. But I was looking to the left. There is this one last thing that I'd like to say. Really, I'm actually rather ashamed of myself. Jack, every time he ever quoted anything, it was always Greek or Roman. But one thing keeps going through my mind, this line from a musical comedy. I said to Bobby, I have to talk with somebody. I have to see somebody. This line from a musical comedy has become almost an obsession with me. At night, before going to bed, we had this old Victrola. We'd play a couple of records. I'd get out of bed at night and put a record on when it was so cold. There was a song that he loved at the end. He loved Camelot. It's the last song on the last side of the record. Ask every person if he's heard the story, and tell it loud and clear if he has not. How once there was a spot for one brief, shining moment. It will never be that way again. Oh, I know that there will be other great presidents, and the Johnsons have been wonderful to me. But there will never be another Camelot. Jack loved history so much. History made Jack what he was. This sick little boy, he sat and read history. Scarlet fever, this little boy in bed so much of the time, all the time that he was in bed as a little boy, he was reading history. He was reading Marlborough and the Knights of the Round Table, and he just loved that song. So then I thought, well, if history made Jack that way, then maybe others also. History. I will tell all of you one thing. When this is all finally over, I am going to crawl into the deepest retirement there is. I'm not going to be one of those people who goes around talking about themselves all the time. I don't want to go out on a Kennedy Drive, to go to a Kennedy airport, to visit a Kennedy school. I don't want medals for Jack. I don't want to be seen by crowds. I have everything I want. I have that flame at Arlington Cemetery. Sometimes at night you come over the hill and you see that Lee mansion all lit up. It's one of the first things Caroline ever recognized. I care about that flame. Caroline, do you know, all through the funeral services, Caroline held on to my hand like a trooper. She's my helper. She's mine now. John, well, John makes friends with everyone immediately. He surprises me in so many ways. I would like John to grow up to be a fine young man. I have no better wish for him. I would like John to be a good boy. So, do you know, I suppose I have known the answer to my question all along. My question earlier about what to do next. There's really only one thing I can do, isn't there? Save my children. They have got to grow up without thinking back at their father's murder all the time. They have to grow up intelligently, attuned to life in a very important way. That is how I wish to live my life too. Moving to New York with John and Caroline, that will be good for me and stop me brooding all the time. Oh, I can't thank all of you enough for coming here today and listening to me. Perhaps, together, all of us, perhaps we can help others, like those crowds outside my house, to understand that we are all human. Even though a person may be very well known, they still hold in their hearts the emotions of any other person. For those moments that are the most important we will know in life. For marriage, and death, and birth. And so, I do remain Mrs. John F. Kennedy. Thank you all so much for listening.